Welcome, brave souls, to Midnight Whispers. Traverse this realm at your own peril. For within these tales lurk horrors most foul. Tonight's tale may twist the very fabric of your sanity. And a word to the wise, this narrative paints pictures of terror not meant for every eye or ear. Venture ahead if you dare, but remember, you have been warned. I had labeled the last box, books, in a hurried scrawl. The ink from my marker bleeding into the cardboard as if foreshadowing the dusky New York twilight. It was done, my entire life packed, moved, and now stacked in what would be my home. The apartment was a fifth-floor relic in a building that groaned with the weight of its years, nestled among the newer, shinier facades of the city. The previous tenant, Mrs. Henley, was just leaving as I arrived that first day. She was an older woman, her hair a cloud of white, her back bent like the boughs of an ancient tree. She clutched a single suitcase, her life condensed into a portable cube of memories. "Dear, take care of the old gal," she said, her voice a crackle of autumn leaves. "She's seen more than most and tells less than few." I smiled politely, not fully understanding. "I will, Mrs. Henley. I hope your new place is nice." She had nodded, eyes momentarily catching the fading light, then trundled past me, her hand grazing the brass frame of the peculiar elevator as she went. It felt like a silent farewell to an old friend. That evening, I ventured down to the lobby, a space grand and yet subdued, the air scented with a history of perfumes and dust. The modern elevator was quick to open with a welcoming ding as residents bustled in and out, but I couldn't shake my fascination with the other one, the ancient lift that seemed almost alive in its stillness. I must have been staring a tad too long, because the doorman, a grizzled fellow with eyes like tarnished silver, approached me. "Curiosity's a mighty force, ain't it?" he said, catching my gaze. I chuckled, a little embarrassed to be caught. "Yeah, I guess so. I've never seen anyone use that one. Is it just for show?" He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "Nah, it works. But it's old finicky. Takes a special key to operate. Ain't no reason to use it when we got the new ones running just fine." "A special key, huh?" I mused aloud. "Sounds like it has its own story." The doorman looked at me, his eyes narrowing just a fraction. "Every corner of this city has a story, miss. Best not to read every book you come across." I nodded, the weight of his words settling in as I turned to leave, the conversation lingering in my mind as much as the image of the elevator's closed doors. Several days slipped by, each marked by the routine of work and the stillness of my apartment as I returned. The building at night seemed to whisper with the echoes of 100 years. The walls thin enough to carry murmurs of my neighbors' lives, but thick enough to keep their secrets. I met a few of them, like Mr. Green from the 7th floor, who claimed he'd lived in the building since the 70s. "Moved in when this place was brand new, I tell ya," he'd said one evening in the elevator, his voice a raspy tune of nostalgia. "Seen people come and go. Seen weird things too." "Weird things?" I prompted, curiosity piqued. He just tapped the side of his nose, his eyes twinkling with a knowledge he didn't share. "Ah, every building has its quirks, its noises, especially the old ones." I'd laughed it off, but his words stayed with me, dancing in the back of my mind as I unpacked another box, as I settled in for the night, as I listened to the rain start to patter against the window. The storm grew quickly, as if the city had angered an ancient sea god who now sought to cleanse the streets with his wrath. Thunder boomed, lightning fractured the sky, and the wind howled through the canyons of skyscrapers. I was alone, the sounds and the fury of the tempest outside a stark contrast to the silence inside. And then, in a moment of quiet between the crashes of thunder, I heard it, a faint ding. The sound wasn't from the modern elevator. It was different, deeper. It was the old elevator. Curiosity, a familiar itch, urged me to peek outside my door. The hallway was dimly lit, shadows playing tricks on my eyes. I padded over to the old elevator, its doors ajar, as if waiting just for me. "Why are you open?" I whispered, half expecting an answer. No reply came, only the call of the tempest outside and the silent beckoning of the empty lift. "I must be crazy," I muttered to myself. But the seed of curiosity Mrs. Henley and Mr. Green had planted bloomed wildly in my mind. Spurred on by the chaotic night, my hand hovered over the button, hesitated, then pressed. The doors responded, opening fully with an inviting grace. The interior was bathed in a warm glow, the wood panels polished to a dark sheen by the hands of time, the mirror on the back wall reflecting a stormy dance of shadows. With a nervous swallow, I stepped inside, the storm's chorus muffled as the doors sealed shut. The doors closed with a definitive sound that seemed to swallow the noise of the storm. My hand brushed against where a panel of floor buttons should have been, but there was nothing, just smooth wood and an air of expectation. "What now?" I murmured, my voice sounding foreign in the confines of the elevator. It began to move then, a gentle descent that felt like a sigh from an old lung. The cabin seemed to breathe with me, the initial comfort of motion giving way to an unsettling speed that stirred the pit of my stomach. Lights flickered overhead, casting wavering shadows that played over the brass and wood. I reached out to steady myself against the mirrored wall as the elevator shuddered. A groan traveling through the structure, like the building was clearing its throat. "It's just old," I tried to reassure myself. Like Mrs. Henley said, it's seen more. But that thought trailed off as the elevator came to an abrupt stop. There was no gentle ding to announce arrival, no doors sliding open to reveal a new floor. Instead, there was darkness as the lights went out, leaving me in a sudden, thick blackness that seemed to press against my eyes. "Okay, not funny," I said, my voice rising in pitch. The darkness was total, the kind of dark you only get when you're deep underground, where the sun is a myth. A sound started then, a hum that seemed to come from the very walls of the elevator, growing in intensity until it filled the cabin, vibrating through my bones. It wasn't mechanical, it was almost human, a chorus of whispers, unintelligible and close, as if a crowd were hidden just beyond a thin veil. My hands fumbled in the dark for a phone, a light, anything, and as my fingers brushed against the cold surface of the mirror, they met something else, something like another hand, cold and insubstantial, retreating as quickly as it had appeared. I recoiled, a scream clawing its way up my throat. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking. There There was no answer, only the whispers growing louder, angrier. They were calling me, not by name, but as if they knew who I was, as if they'd been waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the elevator lurched downward again, the descent this time reckless, like a stone sinking in a dark ocean. I stumbled, my back hitting the mirrored wall, which no longer felt solid. It was giving way, like the surface of water, ripples spreading out from where I pressed. And I could see something, shapes moving in the dark glass, twisted and contorted, shades of gray and black, with eyes that caught the little light there was and reflected it back with malice. The elevator's fall came to a stop so suddenly that my knees buckled. The whispering ceased, replaced by a silence that buzzed with anticipation. The air turned cold, each breath a cloud before my face, and my heart beat a frantic rhythm, desperate to wake from this nightmare. I thought of screaming, but what would be the point? The storm was still raging outside, the sound of it faint but present, a reminder of a world that seemed very far away. The mirrored surface before me began to clear, like fog dissipating at the rise of the sun. But what it revealed was no dawn. It was an endless corridor, dark and stretching into oblivion, lined with doors that promised secrets and screams. I should have felt relief at the sight of an escape, but instead, a paralyzing dread took hold. Where was this place? It was not my building, not my world. As the elevator doors creaked open, a chill wind whispered through the corridor, and I knew deep down that stepping out would be crossing a threshold from which there was no return. Where am I? The question was a wisp of sound, but it was answered by the faintest of laughter, echoing down the endless hall. The laughter that snaked its way down the corridor was a sound that seemed not to belong to one being, but to many. A congregation of mirth at my expense. With my heart hammering against my ribs, I knew I had to make a choice. The idea of stepping out into that corridor terrified me, but the thought of staying in the elevator, a box of darkness and whispers, was unbearable. With a hesitant step, I crossed the threshold, the elevator giving a shuddering groan as if to protest my decision. The carpet beneath my feet was thick with dust, as though centuries had layered there. The air smelled ancient, a mix of mold and something sweeter, something rotting. The doors that lined the hallway stood silent, sentinels guarding their unseen charges. I chose one at random, anything to hide from the unnerving openness of the corridor. The door creaked open at my touch, protesting as if it hadn't moved in ages. Beyond it was darkness so profound, so absolute. It was as if I was looking into the void itself. But then, something shifted in that abyss. Something stirred, and my eyes struggled to make sense of what I saw. It was a mass, a writhing, seething mass of hands. They were of all sizes, all shapes, pale and dark, some gnarled with age, others small and delicate. They reached out as if starved for touch, grasping blindly. A silent scream built in my chest as the mass surged forward, a wave of flesh and bone. I slammed the door shut and stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The hands, however, were not confined by such simple barriers. They emerged from the small space beneath the door, fingers first, like worms wriggling from the earth. They reached for my ankles, my shoes, my sanity. I ran. The corridor stretched on interminably, doors flanking me, each one a portal to another horror, I was sure. I dared not try another to escape the reaching hands. The gamble was too great. The hands were faster than I would have ever thought, scuttling across the floor with the sound of 100 whispers. They clawed at the carpet, leaving trails in the dust as they pursued me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but terror propelled me forward, a fuel that knew no exhaustion. I took turns at random, the hallway fracturing into more passages, a labyrinth designed by madness. It was when I was hopelessly lost, the hands mere inches from my heels, that I stumbled into an open space. It was a room, or so it seemed, grander and more opulent than any other part of this nightmarish place, lined with mirrors that reached from floor to ceiling, reflecting infinite versions of myself, all pale and wide-eyed with fear. And there, in the center of this chamber, stood a figure. It was draped in shadows, its form human but elongated, stretched by the mirrors into something grotesque and distorted. It turned to face me, and where its face should be was a blank canvas, a void no reflection could capture. The mass of hands hesitated at the entrance to this mirrored room, fingers twitching in anticipation, but not daring to enter. It was as if they were afraid, subservient to the figure that now began to move toward me. "Who are you?" My voice was a wisp of sound, stolen by the vastness of the room. The figure didn't speak. Instead, it reached a hand, its proportions uncanny. And as it touched the surface of a mirror, the glass rippled like water. I was trapped between a sea of hands and this being of mirrors and shadows. The hands desired to pull me back into the darkness, but the figure, it wanted something more. It wanted to show me the other side of the glass. And I knew, with a clarity that cut through the fear like a knife, that whatever lay beyond those mirrors was far worse than the hands that now quivered with fear behind me. I rushed forward, looking to avoid the creature to my back, my breaths shallow and quick, my mind racing for a solution. Then, the broken chains on the floor caught the edge of my vision, remnants of some long-forgotten purpose, now possibly a lifeline. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy links, the metal coarse and real against my skin. With a primal yell, I swung the chain at the creature in front of me, a desperate bid to hold back the darkness. The links whistled through the air, striking with a force that reverberated up my arm. To my horror, the creature's form merely absorbed the impact, hands emerging to snatch the chain mid-flight. The force of its pull was staggering. I was wrenched forward, then hurled aside like a rag doll. The world spun wildly, a disorienting blur of up and down. I crashed against the wall, the impact stealing the breath from my lungs. I gasped, my body crying out in protest, vision blurred with tears of pain and fear. And that's when I saw it, a glimmer of hope in this pit of despair. Above me, partially obscured by shadow, was the outline of a hatch. It was an aberration in the design, something I hadn't noticed in the overwhelming dread of my arrival, perhaps meant to be found only by those with nothing left to lose. Gritting my teeth against the pain, I pushed pushed my body to move, the creature was already advancing, its many hands reaching out with a hunger that promised a fate worse than death. I refused to be its victim. With a surge of will, I forced myself up, my hands clawing for the walls, searching for holds, anything. It was then that I felt it, a small, protruding latch, nearly seamless with the surrounding structure, cold and slightly rusted under my frantic fingers. I pulled with everything I had left, a silent plea to the universe not to let this be the end. The hatch swung open with a creak of neglect, revealing a narrow passage upwards. I scrambled inside, dragging my aching body into the gap. I heard the creature hiss with rage, felt the disturbance in the air as it lunged towards my escape route. I didn't look back. With adrenaline as my fuel, I heaved the hatch shut just as a myriad of hands slammed against the other side, the sound echoing in the cramped space. For a moment, I lay there, panting, listening as the creature's wrathful attempts to follow me grew fainter. The passage above was my path to safety, a lifeline to a world where light still existed. I began the arduous crawl, each movement pained but purposeful, driven by the visceral need to survive. Behind me, the hatch held, a barrier between myself and the abyss. When at last I emerged, spilling out into a corridor that was starkly mundane, I was reborn into the light of a reality I had almost lost. I leaned against the wall, my body weak but alive. Alive in a way I had never truly appreciated before. The ground level of the apartment building was silent as a crypt as I made my exit. There was no sign of the creature, no hint of the struggle that had occurred just floors below. Emerging from the claustrophobic passage into the dimly lit corridor of the building's underbelly, I could feel the heavy silence as a physical presence, a stark contrast to the hellish cacophony I had just escaped. I leaned heavily against the cool wall, allowing myself a moment to collect my thoughts, my ragged breathing gradually evening out. As I made my way toward the stairs, the mechanical sound of the elevator coming to life startled me, an ordinary noise that now seemed so alien. The doors slid open, but I didn't step inside. The thought of confining myself in that small space again was unbearable. Instead, I took the stairs, climbing towards the world I knew, each step reaffirming that I was still here, still real. My mind reeled, struggling to process the impossibility of what had transpired below. It was during these moments of ascent that I heard the footsteps, a measured tread that echoed in the stairwell. Rounding the corner, I came face to face with the maintenance man. His appearance was so ordinary it was jarring. He looked up from his key ring, heavy with an assortment of keys. But it was one in particular that caught my eye. An ancient-looking key, elaborate and out of place among the others. "You're Anna, right? The new tenant?" His voice was tinged with a concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. There was a depth to his gaze, an unsettling sort of knowledge, as if he saw beyond the facade of normalcy. "Yes," I managed to say, though my voice sounded distant, even to myself. There was a problem with the elevator." His nod was almost imperceptible, as if he knew precisely what I meant, but chose not to acknowledge it directly. These old buildings, they can be tricky. "If you need anything, just call the front desk," he said, turning to continue his rounds, the key catching the light as he moved. The journey back to my apartment was surreal. The once welcoming hallways now felt oppressive, the shadows lurking with potential terrors. When I reached my door, I hesitated before keying in the code, half expecting the nightmare to spill out into the light. But when the door swung open, it revealed only the silent, untouched living space I had left behind. I stepped inside, locking the door behind me, a futile gesture of safety that nonetheless offered a sliver of comfort. I moved to the window, pulling it open to let in the night air, the sounds of the city filtering in. So normal, so blissfully mundane. As I sank onto the couch, my body finally allowed itself to feel the full extent of the ordeal. Bruises were forming, aches and pains making themselves known. But it was the emotional toll that was most profound. Tears came unbidden, not just of fear, but of relief. I was alive when, by all accounts, I should not have been. Perhaps tomorrow I would ask questions, or maybe I would find a new place to live. But for tonight, I would rest. For even in the aftermath of horror, life goes on, and I had been given a second chance at mine. And so, another tale from the depths of night concludes. But remember, dear listeners, in the realm of midnight whispers, the echoes of our stories never truly fade. If tonight's tale left you hungering for more, explore our anthology of horrors. For those brave enough, delve into our previous stories and discover what lurks in the shadows. Before you venture back into the safety of daylight, remember to like this video if it sent shivers down your spine. Subscribe and ring the bell, so the whispers of the midnight hour always find their way to you. And should you dare, leave your thoughts and feelings in the comments below. We revel in knowing which parts of our tales resonate with your darkest curiosities. Until next time, keep listening to the whispers, for they have many tales to tell.